Sister, 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 wife, please, my mother, drop your knife. It can result to a loss of a life. Do not violate the right. Oh, my daddy is a right. Do not force her to a knife. Sister, 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 wife, please, my mother, drop your knife. It can result to a loss of a life. Do not violate the right. Oh, my daddy is a right. Do not force her to a knife my way. Do not harm this character. I say no.
My name is Lamin Kesedi, a child rights activist. I work for the Child Protection Alliance. I welcome you to this important panel discussion on sexual and gender-based violence. And with me, very distinguished personalities in the field of women empowerment. I will start with the gentleman from my far right to introduce himself, and then it goes that way.
Thank you very much, Lamin. My name is Fatou, and I am the National Coordinator of the Network Against Gender-Based Violence. The network is a membership-based organization of different civil society organizations that are working to protect the rights of women and children in the Gambia. And we also working to ensure we combat sexual and gender-based violence.
Thank you very much, ma'am.
Hello, my name is Tabunjai Sar. I am a member of the Civil Society Gender Platform on Transitional Justice. This platform was set in 2017, and its main objective is to ensure that Transitional Justice program or processes is gender responsive.
Thank you very much, ma'am.
Good day everyone, and thank you, Lamin, for having me. My name is Bafu Jeng, Senior State Counsel at the Ministry of Justice and a member of the Sexual and Gender-Based Violence Unit of the Ministry.
Thank you all for the introduction, and looking forward to a fruitful discussion. Tabu, can you take us through why this event?
Thank you once again, Lamin. I think this event is very important to all of us that are seated here, simply because it's a project that is funded by the Irish government and to the UN Transitional Justice and Human Rights Project, which is under the UNDP and OECHR. Its main objective is to make sure that there is support given to sexual and gender-based violence victims or survivors, and ensure that their participation in the truth and reconciliation processes in the Gambia is ensured.
Thank you very much. Fatou, we are told that sexual and gender-based violence encompasses threats and coercion. It can be physical, emotional, psychological, or sexual in nature, and can take the form of a denial of resources or access to services. It inflicts harm on women, girls, men, and boys. A big constituent for that matter. Put this in context for us.
Thank you very much, Lamin. As you alluded to, sexual and gender-based violence is a very wide topic, and like it has different forms, like you mentioned. And coming home to the Gambia, we know that sexual and gender-based violence do exist in the Gambia, even though we know also that discussing the sexual and gender-based violence issues is regarded as a taboo culturally in the Gambia, and this has made many people not to speak up or to report cases in our society. However, from the statistics that we've collected from service providers, few service providers for that matter in the Gambia, we've realized that there is an increase over the past 5 years in the number of sexual and gender-based violence that are reported. We've recorded over 2,000 cases, to be specific 2,030 cases from 2015 to date. And this year alone we recorded over 72 cases. And of this, most of the cases are around 50% when we calculate it are sexual violent cases, mostly rape, defilement, and sexually related offenses. And also we've realized that most of the perpetrators of this form of violence are men and boys. And most of the victims are women and girls, over 95%. And also we've realized that over 75% of the victims are also children, that is below 18 years of age. So this is a cause for concern, because we know that sexual and gender-based violence has a lot of consequences, not only on individuals, but also on our families, our communities, and the national development in general. So it is something that should be regarded as a priority by everyone, and also by the state. And this is why it's worthwhile discussing, so that people could understand the nature and also the impact of sexual and gender-based violence in our people in the Gambia.
Follow over 2,000 cases is staggering. Now, and 50% constitute sexual violence.
50%.
About 50% constitute sexual violence. Now, it will interest us to know what constitute the other 50%.
Yeah, the other 50% consists of economic violence and also emotional psychological violence, as well as physical violence. And it is surprising to note that in fact physical violence is the smallest percentage. And that's not surprise for people who understand the Gambian nature, because most of the physical violence happens at home. And it happens between people who are very closely related, husband and wife, or people of bloodly relations. And because of this, and because in our culture we hardly discuss these issues, and also because in our culture we tend to protect people, especially when it comes to sexual and gender-based violence, we try to protect the perpetrators more than the victim. Therefore, most of these cases are not reported. And just to also make it very clear that 2,030 cases I talked about are only the very few reported cases within the Kanifing municipality and Banjul mostly. Only CRR is included. So all the other regions in the Gambia, their statistics are not included. And even within the greater Banjul here, there are so many unreported and even some reported cases that are not included in the statistics. So this is just a tip of the iceberg, just to give us a synopsis of the prevalence of sexual and gender-based violence.
What triggers sexual and gender-based violence?
Sexual and gender-based violence, the causes are many, but it all boils around power relations and the unequal power balances between men and women.
You mean the physical power?
Not only the physical power. When we talked of power, it comes in different perspectives. You talked about political power, the cultural power, and social power. You talked about the physical power, of course, but power of authority, those in authority, in position, the power they have.
Which mainly resides in men.
Yes, in men. So you look at the Gambian context, you look at all those different forms of power, including economic power, is in the hands of men most of the time.
And the economic power here, you are implying that the man controls the pocket.
Yes, pocket controls the finance. And in most families, it's the man who holds the financial power. And he who holds those powers controls the other one. And not only controls, but as I always say, the human being is mostly a selfish animal. And because we are selfish in nature, when we have power and we have control over others, we tend to abuse that power in our own ways to satisfy our own selves. Yeah.
Tabu, here is an issue of power. Now, knowing fully well that society presents itself to us in this way, understanding that men decides, what role do you play in ensuring that there is empowerment to be able to, balance this power that we're talking about here?
Thank you very much, Lamin. I think as Fatou has elaborated more on it, our role as women's rights advocate is simply to make sure that the power that resides, the power imbalance that resides between people, I could say, because it's not only men and women that gender-based violence occurs, but we have to look at it in different perspectives, that even people living with disabilities suffer this predicament. But what the platform does is to make sure that Sgbv in the TJ process, within the context of transitional justice, we could see that it's one of the topics, one of the thematic areas that the Transitional Justice, especially the Truth, Reconciliation and Reparation Commission, is looking into, simply because, as Fatou rightly said, this is a taboo. Sex is not normally discussed within us, and there is also power imbalances. There is also societal norms and practices and beliefs, but also at the same time, there is victim blaming and judgmental also when this is when this comes out in the open. So if we want to unpack this, we have to look at the underlying factors that are responsible. This is dealing with society, because that is where power emanates, and that is where the beliefs and the practices are built in. These are mindsets that are built in people, and it's accepted as normal. And because, of course, as he said, the little data that is gathered, it's not sufficient enough to change the belief or change the mindsets of people. So what we intend, or what we do, or what we advocate for, is to make sure that those underlying factors, the structural inequalities that exist within our society, are dismantled. And when we try to do that, there are so many strategies that are involved. It's not only to advocate to government, but also to go down grassroots and make sure that community members are empowered. Simply, how do we do? When we say empowerment, it is a process that makes sure that those that don't have voice or don't have power realizes the dynamics that goes along with the imbalances that occurs within the society. That these beliefs are supposed to be changed.
Are men critical in this process?
Extremely critical, because if you look at the perpetrators, mainly they are men, and educating men to change their behavior, or educating men to make sure that the power that resides in them is not exploited or abused, is very important. And this is the belief. This is where most of the activities that we conduct is centered around. It's like building the capacities of people to make sure that we use the power, we use our offices, we use our privileges responsibly rather than abuse it. Because when we abuse it, we harm, we maim. And Fatou has rightly said that the consequences of Sgbv is not only to silence the victim, but also society has negatively received it, because if it is within the family, because it happens in both public and private spheres. If it is within the family, the members of the family suffer the consequences. If it is outside the family, in public places, for example, looking at the TJ process, I mean, the trust that resides in people diminishes or decreases, because people of authority use this power to perpetrate sexually. And we have to also note that when sexual violence takes place, it takes place within the context of where the victim doesn't have any other way to express himself or herself, especially when you are surrounded with socio-cultural norms and belief that if you speak out, you're blamed. If you speak out, you're not only blamed, but generations after generations that come after you will be blamed and will pay the price.
Absolutely. What is the way out for women?
The way out for women, as Fatou rightly said, speak up. Speak up, because when you speak out, you're not only saving yourself, but you're saving others. Because if a perpetrator is within the community and sexually abusing, for example, a girl child, and this is brushed under the carpet within the context of the culture of silence that we all grew up with, that person will go on not only molesting others, but everybody within that community who is less privileged, who hasn't got the power to fight back, is also affected.
Fatou, who listens when women speak?
Thank you very much, Lamin. When women speak, everyone should listen, because especially when it concerns sexual and gender-based violence, because we're talking about the victims and survivors. So if we want to address sexual and gender-based violence, we need to ensure that we listen to the victims, to the survivors, because they are the ones who feels it, and see who feels it knows it better. So it is very important that we listen to them if we want to address sexual and gender-based violence. But I just want to add to what Tabo was saying. You see, the issue of sexual and gender-based violence is inbuilt in the social fabric of our society. So if we want to really change this issue and the power imbalances and the power dynamics between the two genders, we have to go back to that social fabric. We have to go back to the socialization system, where boys and girls are socialized to believe in certain gender norms, which promotes superiority of men and boys over the women, which make women to be silent and not to speak out when they are violated, which make the woman and the girl to believe that violence is acceptable, and which makes the boy and the man to believe that controlling women, violating women is normal. So we need to change that. And to change that, we also need to look at the gender roles. And this is why I always say that we need to redefine our gender roles. Because it's this gender roles that depicts the power imbalances in the society. Because what your roles and what the expectation of the society is for the man is what makes that society or that family to prepare that boy to become the man tomorrow. And in preparing that boy to perform those roles and responsibilities tomorrow, you need certain things in place. And this is where the discriminations begin, because they would say that you would be the head of the family. You will be the one who will be responsible. So they prepare you to be socially strong, to be economically strong, to be politically strong, and to be religiously strong, and have education over the woman or the girl. Because for the woman, they said, what do? You are expected to perform domestic chores. You understand? And because your role is only within the home, and it doesn't mean that you need to go and get money to pay certain things to ensure that the family is taken care of. Normally, the woman is given a second chance. It's always the boy that is given the first chance for education, the first chance to learn trade, the first chance, to have the social powers, that's positions within the society, and the woman
becomes
being the supporter and an alternative behind to push men forward. And this has to change. Unless and until we change this, the power imbalances will continue to remain, and as far as this power imbalances continues to remain, sexual and gender-based violence will also continue to rise in our society.
Sexual and gender-based violence is a violation of human rights. It denies the human dignity of the individual and hurts human development. Therefore, what mechanisms are in place? Because we know, as Fatou said, human being in nature is selfish. It's about power relation. And we know laws ensures that power is controlled, is managed. What is in place?
Thank you very much, and I must also congratulate the previous speakers, because they've put the issue we're discussing into context. And of course, we cannot deny the fact that sexual and gender-based violence is an existing practice in the country, and it comes in all forms, and that it has already been highlighted that the different facets in which the less vulnerable, and when I talk about the less vulnerable here, of course, women and children comes to mind, and of course, persons with disabilities. They are all affected. So basically, government has a in fact, not government has the absolute role to play in terms of creating the enabling environment and for the protection of law, for the protection of the rights of these affected persons. And government can only do that through the creation of laws. And these laws are not just to be created and forgotten. They are to be created and to be implemented. Of course, government has a commitment, government has an obligation which is based on the fact that instruments have been signed, conventions have been signed, charters have been signed at the level of the UN, at the level of the AU, and all these things need to be reflected at the national level. And the reflection is by creating the national laws that can protect all persons, including women and children. And since 20, it's been ongoing, and government has been relentless in the creation of laws. And we've had laws for the protection of people. I can go as far back as 2005 when we've had the Children's Act, which is set in place for the protection of children from all forms of violence, to protect them from abuse, to protect them from harm, and also all sorts of abuses. And not only at the level of the children, but then you go to from 2013 to date, we have had series of laws that are created to promote the protection of women and children, and in fact, everyone. We've had the Sexual Offences Act. There's also the Domestic Violence Act, which is set in place to make sure that all forms of domestic violence, be it sexual violence, be it the physical violence, be it the economical, the psychological form of violence, are all women are, and men also are protected. But in this context, women are the most vulnerable. So we will mostly concentrate on them. So it's the laws are there. Government has been doing what it can in terms of creating the laws, because it can only be identified as an offense when there is a law set in place to make it an offense. So government has taken up the first responsibility, which is to create laws, and these laws are already in place for the protection of all against sexual and gender-based violence.
Before we know, laws are supposed to be enforced, and it's only when they are enforced that we can really get rid of or suppress all that has been said. What is the degree of enforcement of our laws in respect of protecting women and children, and of course, in general, averting sexual and gender-based violence in our community?
Are to be respected, the laws are to be enforced, the laws are to be implemented, and it doesn't take one institution to implement the laws. It does not take one institution to enforce the law. It takes a system, and that is the system. Every part of the system has a role to play to make sure that these laws are effectively implemented, because it takes the police at the time of reporting of the case to effectively investigate the case, forward it to the relevant authorities, be it the Ministry of Justice, for them to effectively prosecute the matter, and then that prosecution is done through the courts. So basically, there is a system set in place, and in fact, when we're talking about the prosecution of these cases, the hospital will also have a role to play. So there are different parts in the system that each has a role and responsibility to play in terms of supporting the law, in terms of making sure that the law is implemented. So it does not take one institution, and every institution that is part of that system needs to play its role to make sure that the laws are effectively implemented.
Fatou, what is your view about the systems? Because it's very important. She has mentioned the systems. What is your, from civil society perspective, what is your view about the systems in place?
Thank you very much, Lamin. Before coming to the system, I just want to say that I quite agree with Bafu when she says that we have comprehensive and good laws in the Gambia. And also I agree that there are some systems that are put in place. For instance, government has created different kinds of structures and units within the different sectors of the government to address sexual and gender-based violence alongside the laws that are created. However, our problem is the enforcement of these laws. When laws are formulated or enacted. Units are set up to enforce those laws or implement them. But those units are not empowered. Then we have a problem. And I think that's where the government needs to look at, because you create units, but you do not economically empower those units. You do not personally empower those units with the right numbers and quality of personnel to ensure those units are effectively functional. And this is where we got it wrong, because it's not about only creating the units, but it's about ensuring the units are allocated with enough funds, and the units are also given enough staffs with quality, with qualifications to ensure that they are able to effectively execute their function. And this is where we need to look at and strengthen as a government and as a nation to ensure that those units function effectively. And also, secondly, one important mechanism in the fight against sexual and gender-based violence is the community. The community structure.
In fact, I will bring you to that point.
Those structures needs to be strengthened, and to ensure that they are able to take up their responsibilities, to ensure that cases happening within the communities are reported. Because mind you, no matter how much money is invested, no matter how much units we have set up, and no matter how much laws we have created, if the cases are not reported, all those things would be useless. So cases needs to be reported so that the laws could take its course to deter other people from continuing to perpetuate sexual and gender-based violence.
And Tabo, I want to bring you into, I want us to look at this. We know the older generation already have their minds formulated, and I'm not saying it can't be changed, but it may take time to really, change their mindset about how they view these issues. Therefore, I am with the view that probably the young generation may be of great importance in terms of, combating sexual and gender-based violence. What role do you think the young generation can play?
Thank you very much once again. I think this is one area that people can learn from. This platform that is set up just to discuss it, because as you said, within the older generation, sex is something that was not even talked about in the family, let go in the community. But the young generation has series or numerous avenues that they can use to make sure that this Sgbv is addressed. Simply because now we are in the age of technology, now we are in the age of social media, and not only that, but people are empowered enough to speak out, to say that, to make sure that they have access to some of the social services when they need it. But coming back to the moment that we are in, the Gambia is going through transitional justice, and one of the main area that it focuses, especially on the TRRC, is Sgbv. Now, with the numerous reform processes that are going on, some of these laws are being looked into, as my landed friend has rightly stated. The institutional reforms that are taking place, because when you unpack Sgbv from the TRRC point of view, you will realize that there are so many factors that were revealed from the testimonies. You have societal norms, you have power imbalances, you have structural inequalities, as well as you have injustice. And people in high profile also abuse their authority. And this gives us the reality that we really encountered institutional weakness or institutional failures. So the transitional justice process is out to remedy, to make sure that all these inadequacies or all these challenges that we face for the past 22 years is structured, it's reformed. So with the young people really on contributing towards the towards this process, I think it can go a long way in addressing some of the sexual and gender-based violence. By the way, in the TRRC, 54 men and women, not only women, but men and women, have testified and have actually said that they were sexually abused. Wow. So in that is, even one is a huge number. Yeah. Let go 54.
Like we said, one too many.
One is too many, really. And Fatou has said that, elaborated on the consequences of Sgbv, that it does not only maim, it does not only cause harm, but it can also result to death. And the dynamics of Sgbv that was brought out by the TRRC is unimaginable, because it's not only a direct penetration or sexual intercourse that happened, but there were many forms. Exactly. That many victims or survivors have testified before the TRRC. So this shows you that as a society, we have a problem, because this is painful, this is harmful, but also this is a human right issue. And if we are to have in a democratic society, as we want to in years to come through the transitional justice process, most of these ills need to be addressed.
Thank you. Before I want to ask you about, I want to relate a question to the statistics Fatou gives, but you know, Tabu came from an angle that I want us to start with. The TJ process, you know, seeks to unearth the practices that were in existence. It exposes the system that we have in place. Now, I know after all this, the expectation is that recommendations will be placed before the government. What after TRC or after the TJ processes, what is in place to ensure that those institutional reforms, what is at stake?
Thank you. I think that's a very important question, because it's one thing to set in a TJ process, another thing to set in the system that will foresee the continuity of the findings of that process. And of course, government has set in place, at the level of the Ministry of Justice, in order to accompany the TJ process. That was why sometime in 2018, a new unit was created to on sexual and gender-based violence, to make sure that priority will be given to cases of sexual and gender-based violence, to make sure that the police will be supported in terms of investigation, because the unit is made up of police and state lawyers and a social worker. And this will make, in order to make sure that we monitor and also to coordinate and collaborate with the police in order to support the prosecution, the investigation, because it all starts with the investigation, which has to go down also to the society. But then we will get to that, I'm sure. So it's about how to support the investigations and how to make sure that the prosecutions are effectively done in terms of prosecuting cases of sexual violence. So these are all things that will accompany the TJ process, and at the end of the day, by the time the TRRC is done with their findings and will have recommendations forwarded to the ministry, to the government, of course, it's we have already started the process.
Okay, so this process that you're talking about is already in place.
It's already in place.
Perfect.
It's already in place. All it needs is to be strengthened to make sure that it's it will properly execute its function, because it's about we've seen, of course, from the statistics, these are just the reported cases, but you can tell that it's a very huge number.
It's a huge number.
So these kind of cases, how do we make sure that when they get to court, how do we effectively prosecute them? And also not only that, but how do we make sure that priority is given to these cases so as not to bore the society, so as not to make them lose hope in the system. So because the delay in the prosecution of these kind of cases can also have an impact on how the society see the system. So these are all things that we want to look into, and having this unit at the Ministry of Justice, and I'm sure it will not only stop at this unit, but we have it with a start on this unit, it will go a long way in making sure that we prioritize issues of sexual and gender-based violence.
Over 2,000 cases have been reported. Do you have some of this or all of these cases before you?
Good. Yes. Like Fatou has mentioned, they are the custodian of this report. Of course, it's a combination. From government and also, yes, mostly from government. But then it's important to know that not all these cases are before the court, because some of them may have been withdrawn along the way. Some may have not even reached the level of prosecution. So you see, and that is not well, these are the challenges that we face. So we just have to be frank about the discussions, because you can see that the problem starts from the society and also comes to the institutions. But then at the level of the Ministry of Justice, we are trying all means to make sure that cases of sexual and gender-based violence, most especially sexual violence, because these are the cases that are brought to our office, are not withdrawn based on the whims and caprices of an individual who does not want the case to go forward, because these are the kind of things that we have faced. You see a person, most times it's not the victim themselves who will want the case to be withdrawn, but it's a relative, it's a family member, it's the uncle, it's the father. Why would they want the cases to be withdrawn? They need to be aware of the long-term consequences, the short-term consequences, the psychological effects that the victim will be going through, that it's not about honoring your family name, it's not about the fact that the perpetrator is a family member, it's the fact that justice needs to be done. It's the fact that that victim needs to see that justice is done because she has been violated. So all these things are there, but then with respect to the number of cases we have at the office, we have quite a number. We have quite a number, but I can certainly tell you that not all the cases that we do here are before the courts.
Are you constrained in any ways?
Yes, at the level of the ministry, we've been faced with a lot of challenges in terms of the, you know, in terms of, because we're not only concentrating on the prosecution of these kind of cases, but to prioritize these cases and to make sure that we give so much concentration to it. That was why in 2016 the Sgbv unit was formed, and the unit will make sure that we will give the time necessary for each case of sexual violence that is brought before us. But then in terms of prosecution, it's not wholly managed by the Ministry of Justice, because the state lawyers, all we can do is that when the case is brought to us, you will forward it to the court. Now, it has the time management is shared between the courts, the judiciary, and the ministry, the state prosecutors. So basically, that is also where the challenge is. And unless we can, you know, get specialized courts in terms of, you know, the courts that will be responsible solely for the prosecution of or hearing cases on sexual violence, I cannot say that you know, the capacity. Of course, the capacity at the level of the ministry is being boosted up, but that it does not wholly stop at the capacity level, because you may have all the capacity in the world, but the time management is not solely responsible, is not solely managed by the ministry, which is
not in your control.
It's not in our control. We share it with the judiciary.
Thank you very much.
Yes, in addition to what Bafo has just said, Bafo has dilated mainly on the institutional arrangement that is in place. But now, where I want to talk about, because on Sgbv there are a series of pillars that we unearth, such as Bafo said, institutional structures, but then also society. The social injustice. Where does it happen? It happens within the society, and that's where power is. So we need to look into. We need to look into where power lies, who decides within the family, who decides within the communities, who are the custodians of culture, and this is where the bulk of the work is. I mean, traditional authorities, mothers, fathers. These are people that preserves culture and handed culture to generations after generations. And I think when we want to talk about Sgbv within the society, to make sure that some cultural norms, of course not everything in our culture is bad, there are good things, some cultural norms and practices that are detrimental to our well-being, to our survival, need to be discussed. And if Sgbv is one of those that cannot be discussed because it's a taboo, I think it is now time that we bring it to the forefront and discuss it in our localities, in our families.
Anti-taboo laws are in place. Does advocacy have a role?
Of course, advocacy has a role. I mean, laws, I think one thing that we fail to address is that the laws that are put in place goes along with the cultural values, goes along. I mean, there must be a link to make sure that they communicate, because they cannot be seen as separate institutions, because I mean, these laws are there to protect us. And if there are cultural practices that we practice or that we believe that are detrimental, as I said, to our health, to our survival, I mean, and degrade our dignity, I think it needs to be addressed. And government, as well as, even though they're high up there, government as well as local people, as well as grassroots, should make sure that there is a platform that we converge. There is a bridge that brings us together. And this is where local women groups, this is where other NGOs, CSOs, all
and
government all come.
So there is need for all these institutions to communicate,
collaborate and make sure that these issues, even though they are against our norms and values, as they said, and our beliefs, need to be discussed.
Follow. In conclusion, what community structures exist?
There are different community structures that exist that can be used. I think one of the structures is the community child protection committees. You have what they call mothers clubs that deals with schools on issues related to sexual and gender-based violence. You also have some of these local government structures like the MDFTs and the like that are at the local level, at the regional level, that can be used. But also we can use institutions like the chiefs and the chief councils and the like who are there, but and also the VDC, Village Development Committees, and the WDC, Ward Development Committees. So all these structures that exist that can be used and strengthened to ensure that they include prevention and reporting of sexual and gender-based violence in their mandates and responsibilities, so that at the community level we can demystify, we can ensure that people understand that now these are unacceptable and we're not going to silence about them anymore. When that happens, then we will begin to see changes at the community. That
means community involved. Before, if you had to recommend one or two things, what would that be?
Continued advocacy, I would say, and because, like you've asked earlier on, the law is to be accompanied with relentless advocacy. The law alone is not going to do it. People need to be aware of the consequences of these practices and how it's affecting our women, our children, how we need to all join hands to make sure that we cop out this practice. And also, if I were to recommend just one thing, is for parents not to try to brush, or our society, we should move away from trying to brush these acts when it happened under the carpet. We should try to make sure that it's reported, and when it is reported, they should support the authorities to do their work and not to interfere, because that is the whole thing. When it comes to issues of sexual violence, most times they would not want to report, or when they are forced to report, some of them will want to withdraw based on the fact that they don't want their family name to be tainted, they feel embarrassed to come out. So all these things, they need to be, they need to know that justice has to be done, and justice can only be done if the people affected are ready to support justice.
The process.
In its work, yeah.
Thank you. Fatou, if you to recommend one or two things in combating sexual and gender-based violence, what will be your message to the listeners?
First and foremost, I would recommend for us to employ strategies and programs that would demystify the cultural norms and the religious misconceptions that promote sexual and gender-based violence in our communities. Secondly, also, I would also recommend we engage on women empowerment programs that would empower women to be able to resist and reject sexual and gender-based violence, because they are mostly the victim. And thirdly, I would also recommend for the laws to be effectively enforced. And this can be done only by ensuring that the government structures that are created for the enforcement of these laws are empowered and strengthened to ensure that they can effectively function. Thank you.
I think for me, I will come from the coming from the TRRC context, as I said, and within the TJ process. I think a recommendation that I will give is to make sure that the informal structures at grassroots are engaged, meaning the women CAFOs, the local groups, the youth groups, the groups that take into consideration the welfare of people living with disabilities. I think these groups, specific groups, can be engaged, and to make sure that prevention and protection are enhanced, as well as to make sure that their participation in decision making. Because when we're talking of women empowerment or empowerment in general, participation is very key. And these informal structures at grassroots are normally not within the discourse, and that is where most of these Sgbv cases take place, and that is where most is brushed under the carpet, simply because they don't know. So if they are engaged, I think it will go a long way in addressing Sgbv in this context.
And finally, before, long overdue is a helpline. I mean, the world has moved towards that direction, that with a click of 3 buttons, somebody comes to your aid. Do we have any?
Yes, you're right. This is well overdue, and of course it's been part of the programs that government has been looking into. And just in July 2020, the ministry, of course the government of the Gambia, with support from its partners, have been working with the Ministry of Women, Children and Social Welfare, and a new number, a helpline has been established in order to make sure that women who are aware, who are suffering, or any person that is aware of any woman or child or any person that is,
or even a man,
because it has already been established that although a case has been reported with Fatou, I'm sure, but then you go, it's already it's no longer in the pipeline, it's already established, and now the 1313 number is created, 1313, and any person that calls through that number will certainly be listened to.
You will have help.
You will have the assistance required.
Thank you very much.
And just to add to that, the 199 has been reactivated as well, and it's going to be launched also within July 2020.
And that specifically deals with issues of
child-related matters. Yeah.
Ladies and gentlemen, our viewers out there, progress has been made on sexual and gender-based matters. You can call 1313 and you will be attended to. And in a very short while, we'll be having 199 where you can call to solicit support for a child, abused or about to be abused. I thank you all, and I'm your host, Lamin Kesedi. Thank you.
Women are important in a society. I say no, 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 no. La vie est lancée, on a fait des boyaux. I say no, 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 no. Tampere jignande tuyuni da munyi jaja. No, no, no.
Don't care about the number, you can always start with 1. Let's help one another shine bright like the sun. Throw away the blades and replace them with books. The book of forces is say, cause it ain't a good look.